So today's episode of the podcast, we're going to be diving deep into probably what we think is one of the most critical topics for businesses operating in the health, social and disability sectors. It's to do with compliance with the SCHADS award. So just from my perspective, in the last week alone, I've had a lot of encounters and a lot of engagements with our individuals that we're supporting here at the moment with quite a lot of different pay rates, overtime classifications and various working conditions for employees. So it's always a fun topic for us. And basically it just makes compliance a must understand for all of the organizations working in our sector. So we're going to be exploring several key areas with two of our expert guests that we've got on board here today. So we're going to have Emma and Michelle joining us from Effective HR. So if you guys would like to go through a quick introduction, I believe, Michelle first, if you'd like.
Perfect, sure. I guess I'll briefly introduce our company first, Effective HR. So we've been in operation for close to 9 years now. We are HR and IR consultants, and we have a division that specifically looks after the SCHADS award for our NDIS industry clients. So it is one of the heaviest and certainly the most difficult awards, which is why we've dedicated specific consultants to understanding that award. So a very busy company. We've got some consultants all across Australia and we help in a lot of different industries, but like I said, the SCHADS being one of the primary ones. Myself, Michelle, I've been in IR or HR for a little over 20 years now. And currently the Managing Director of Effective HR. So I've brought along one of our brilliant consultants today, and I'll let Emma introduce herself, but I'll throw to you, Emma.
Perfect. Thank you, Michelle. Hi, my name's Emma Dawson. I am one of the HR and Work Health and Safety consultants at Effective HR. I have been consulting businesses now for over 9 years. It is my bread and butter, my passion. I'm really interested in ensuring that businesses are appropriately supported with their compliance, their work compliance with the modern awards. I can easily say, having reviewed many of these modern awards, that the SCHADS award is in the top 3 most complicated that we have in Australia. So it is great to be able to provide that support and ensuring businesses are receiving assistance with compliance with the SCHADS award. I also provide a lot of support with all other HR, work health and safety matters, so employee management, HR strategy, providing training to managers and workers, along with a lot of the work health and safety obligations as well. So I think we'll jump in and get started on some of the technical content.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that, guys. Much appreciated. It's from my perspective, just having worked with it for a few years now in the industry, it's just obviously just such a beast to understand all of it. So it's going to be really, really good to get some critical feedback from you guys today. So we're wanting to sort of hear some real world examples of how businesses are struggling with the SCHADS and compliance at the moment, and talk about some practical steps that they can take to sort of overcome those in the future as well. So we've got a few questions to run through today, so might as well get started here. So I guess the first one we've got is basically discussing the importance of compliance. So the importance of compliance around what are some of the key risks that businesses face if they were to fail to comply with the SCHADS award?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, taking that step back, the SCHADS award, what is it? What is its purpose? The SCHADS award, it sets out the minimum standards for employees in the sector. So it covers an array of entitlements including your ordinary hours, penalties, loadings, overtime. It also has a lot of other entitlements that are really specific to the industry. So we see broken shifts, sleepovers, 24-hour shifts, excursions, which we're going to talk a little bit more in detail throughout today's podcast. It's really crucial for businesses operating under this award to comply with all of these requirements to ensure that there is that fair and lawful treatment of employees. At the end of the day, if we're not compliant with the SCHADS award, there are an array of costs that can result. The big ones, financial penalties for non-compliance. We do see very hefty fines from our regulatory bodies, such as the Fair Work Ombudsman. In addition to fines, employers may be required to back pay employees for underpayments, and these back payments can span 7 years, so can be very significant. Reputational damage. So if we're breaching the SCHADS award, that can impact public image, which can, in sectors with disability and community services, that's really important to have that good image. High employee turnover. So if we're failing to meet award conditions, that can lead to higher turnover of employees, and staff will often seek better compliance with businesses that adhere to those industry standards. We all know as well, with higher turnover, there is a lot of cost associated with recruitment, and then also that onboarding and training cost as well. And lastly, audit. So if we are non-compliant in the long term, businesses may face audits and various other legal action. And once again, that all contributes to excessive costs, which is what we're wanting to avoid. So the goal is always, with the SCHADS award, it's complicated, but businesses have that obligation and responsibility to be proactive on that front. We've got the ATO, Fair Work and Safe Work. And even if you're a business with one employee, there's no way around these regulatory bodies. We must comply. You have to comply with super and taxation requirements with the ATO, equally as much as you have to comply with your IR, industrial relations compliance with Fair Work, and your work health and safety obligations under Safe Work.
Yeah, definitely. Well, your last point is certainly not the least, that's for sure. I'm sure a lot of people in this call have had their fair share of interactions with audits, and I'm sure we've all had our fun with that as well. So thank you for that. That's greatly appreciated. The next question we've got for today is understanding the penalties and overtime. So would you mind explaining a little bit regarding the penalties for non-compliance with the SCHADS award, particularly in relation to overtime, if you could, please?
Yes, absolutely. So for businesses in the social and community services sector, managing wage costs, it requires careful consideration, especially when you're factoring in those penalties and overtime. The SCHADS award imposes strict overtime provisions where rates can rise quite substantially, up to 150 or even 200% of the ordinary hourly rate. So these higher rates can quickly inflate payroll costs, particularly when you deal with things like shift work or irregular hours or extended duties. So looking at that slide there are a couple of conditions that can trigger overtime. So the first is if an employee works more than 38 hours in a week. The second is if an employee works more than 8 hours in a single day, unless there's an agreement in place extending this up to 10 hours. So this is where, as HR consultants, we work very closely with businesses to understand their business and to ensure that they have employment contracts that are not only tailored to the business, but they're able to maximize some of these flexibility provisions under the SCHADS award. So having provisions in the employment contract to extend those ordinary working hours up to 10 per day. Thirdly, another trigger will be if any shift extends beyond a 12-hour span. Now, this is specific to broken shifts, and we're going to go through this in more detail throughout today's podcast. Failure to provide a proper meal break, and in 24-hour shift, if there is more than 8 hours of active work being performed, will also trigger overtime. What is the impact of all of this on a business? At the end of the day, if there is a lot of mismanagement of overtime, it's going to trigger ballooning wage costs, and that can threaten the financial sustainability of services and businesses. It's definitely recommended that businesses have accurate, reliable systems for tracking working hours, ensuring that staff are taking their breaks to ensure that all of those hours are recorded correctly, which reduces overtime ultimately being triggered unnecessarily.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you for that. Much appreciated. Another one that we do have here is avoiding common SCHADS award pitfalls. So what would you say are the most common pitfalls businesses encounter when dealing with the SCHADS award? And what steps can businesses take to avoid these common mistakes and ensure their compliance regarding these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to throw this one actually to Michelle, as this is a question she's very well versed with. Michelle, would you like to answer?
Yes. So this is usually where I step in with our clients when it gets very, very nasty, when we start looking at fines and big underpayments and whatnot. So we've got a couple of different things that we need to look at whenever we're helping a client with when it becomes a problem, if they have had a problem in their payroll system. We can have technical breaches, but we can also have those monetary underpayment issues as well that arise. With technical breaches, we can also see our clients face pretty significant fines, which are shown there for individuals and businesses, depending on the size of the company as well. There are obviously things that, you know, in 20 years and since 2009/10, since this award really existed, what we've seen is this, you know, I guess companies are getting a really good understanding now of the SCHADS award regarding, okay, I've got 8 hours or 10 hours by agreement for ordinary, and then overtime kicks in. It's not that we're seeing issues with. It's very much more those much more nuancy sort of roster systems or strange sort of roster setups where there's actually technical breaches of the award that clients don't realize that are occurring. When you add 2 to 3 years to that, plus 100 staff or even 10 staff, suddenly those issues become insurmountable for a company. When we're doing an underpayment calculation for a client, they can take months to start with. The cost of us having to do them is significant, and I hate it. I hate having to pass on invoices for those tasks, but they're just a large cost in itself, not to mention the underpayment, not to mention the potential fines. Technical breaches is when something has been applied or a roster has been created that actually does not work with it doesn't fit within the provisions of the award, and it's a roster that you're basically not allowed to do. So it's not something that you can buy your way out of with overtime or penalties. It's a roster system that's been put in place that's incorrect, basically, and that's what we call a technical breach. So there's sometimes ways around it when we're doing underpayment calculations. They're usually very, very expensive, but quite a lot of the time we can't sort of make it work for a client as well, and it becomes a very, very big underpayment. We go through those common issues in much more detail. Emma takes us through those in much more detail. But yeah, just to outline those breaches and not understanding your roster system and our application of the SCHADS award can be very costly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. The aim of the game definitely seems to be the proactivity, not the reactivity, which is why I'm really glad to see we've got almost 70 people in the call at the moment jumping in to learn a little bit more about it ahead of time, rather than reacting post, which is great to see. One that we do have sort of a continuation of that one there is to do with wage theft and the non-compliance costs. So the implications of wage theft and how does that occur under the SCHADS award, and what are the potential consequences for businesses? Would you be able to provide certain examples of how non-compliance has led to some significant costs, for example, I can see on the screen here now?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're not paying an employee all of those entitlements that are derived from the SCHADS award, ultimately, what's that going to result in? Underpayment of wages. We see underpayment of wages issues almost on a daily occurrence. This is what we do on a day-by-day basis with businesses, and a lot of the time businesses are trying ultimately to do the right thing. It's just that award is so complicated. It's very easy to have accidental mistakes with our rostering systems or payroll systems that result in underpayments. The three common ones that we come across is firstly, incorrect payroll setup. So if you're using payroll software that does not have an award term built into it, it's more just like a standard manual application like Xero or MyOb, the chances are it may be incorrectly set up, and we can see entitlements not being paid compliantly in line with the modern award. Secondly, companies coming up with their own arrangements that they think are more generous, but actually aren't. So for example, loaded rates for sleepover shifts where you pay maybe $100 that will cover the first hour of active duty. This may not actually pass the better off overall test calculation and then therefore result in accidental underpayments. Lastly, employees are paid above award flat rates in lieu of penalty rates. So it's not to say that you can't do this, but you need to tread very carefully in how it's being managed, and most importantly, completing the better off overall test calculation, or the boot calculation, and do those regular reconciliations to ensure that there are no accidental underpayments. You also need to have a written employment contract that specifically covers what award payments are absorbed into above award rates, and sometimes businesses may have individual flexibility agreements on top. while most organizations that we come across want to do the right thing, as we can see, there is now legislation coming into play that's covering businesses that do not. So this is where we're seeing the new wage theft legislation. What is wage theft? Wage theft will occur when an employer underpays their employees, fails to pay entitlements, or otherwise just violates wage-related laws. So this is coming into force on the 1st of January 2025. It will be criminalised nationwide under the Fair Work Act. It is important to note that it is already legislated in some states already on state-based legislation, including Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland.
I can add a little one here as well, just to, I guess, show the importance of it. Without an appropriately written offset clause in employment contract, we've done an underpayment calculation before for a client for one person who was just set up differently to the rest of the team. They thought the underpayment was going to come out at about the $8,000 mark for, I think it was about 2.5 to 3 years of back payment. The offset clause was written very inappropriately for the situation that they were facing, and it turned out to be closer to about $80,000.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. Geez Louise.
It was a problem. Yeah.
Sure. It can be really significant. You know, we saw another example, Australian Unity, big organisation. They were found to underpay 8,900 employees, which was a combined total of $7.3 million. And this has occurred prior to wage theft laws being enforced, but they were still ordered to pay back $250,000 in contribution payments. So you can imagine, you know, come the 1st of January 2025, when these new laws come into play, there's going to be massive penalties, and all of those penalties are outlined on the slide there. So I think, you know, the message here is to be proactive. Yes, there's new laws coming into place on the 1st of January, but it's being proactive, making sure that, you know, we are being compliant with the SCHADS award, that we are paying in line with the SCHADS award or above the SCHADS award. And if we're not sure about any of those provisions, always seeking appropriate advice and support, because it is complicated.
Yeah, no, I absolutely understood there. So I guess for some of us, it's a good time to get started thinking about it, obviously with the 1st of January coming in. But for those of us in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, there's no time like the present by the sounds of it. So, for sure.
Yes.
No, fantastic. So the next one that we do have here is regarding navigating SCHADS award streams. So what challenges do businesses face when navigating SCHADS award streams and classifications, and how can a business ensure that they are classifying employees accurately within the correct stream?
Yeah, absolutely. So home care or the social and community services stream, which one do I apply? I think if I had $1 for every time someone got this one wrong, my mortgage would be paid off by now. It's one of the most common kind of questions we come across is which stream applies to my business. And it's a really important one to get correct, because your stream classification will directly impact your pay rates, overtime, allowances, and various other entitlements under the SCHADS award. So going back to basics, there are 4 streams, firstly, under the SCHADS award. There's the crisis assistance and supported housing sector, SACS, home care, and family daycare and scheme sector. But the purposes of the podcast will focus on the 2 primary ones that we come across, which is SACS and home care. When we look at determining the award stream, why does it matter? Pay rates can be significantly different between the 2. So, for example, if you've got a support worker that's engaged under the home care stream, based on their inherent duties and responsibilities, they might start at a level 2 pay point 1, which could attract a base rate of $24.26 per hour. Whereas the same role, so a support worker under the SAC stream, they may be classified as a level 1 pay point 2, but that attracts a lower base rate of $23.91. You can see bigger differences as well when you're classifying clerical employees, and up to several differences an hour sometimes between those streams. There's also differences with minimum engagement periods for casual and part-timers across the 2 streams as well. Sometimes we get the question, can we just pick the cheapest option and do it that way? No. The way we determine the stream is we need to focus. What is the core business activity? So we're not necessarily looking at where does the NDIS participant funding come from, although that can be sometimes a good indicator. We're looking at very much as at what is your principal business activity, and then we're cross-referencing to those definitions of home care and the SACS sector that are outlined in the SCHADS award. So, for example, you may provide personal care duties for participants. If that happens in the participant's residential home, you could be looking at the home care stream, versus if you're completing those duties in a group home or still accommodation, then the SAC stream may be then a better fit in that circumstance. Stream determination is going to be very specific to a business. One of the common things that we do at Effective HR in supporting businesses is we do award coverage, stream and classification determinations. So we sit with the business to really understand, you know, what is your core business activity, where is going to be the most appropriate fit, and then kind of going through those level classifications. A lot of the time we see issues with employees being classified either too low or too high in the award. Really important to get correct, looking at their inherent duties, autonomy, responsibility, skills, competencies to determine the correct level, and then looking at their industry experience to determine the correct pay point under the award, because that's ultimately determining what the minimum rates of pay are. Another area where we see a lot of confusion is in regards to clerical employees, admin employees. There has been lots of conflicting advice, lots of different interpretations and opinions. Generally speaking, clerical employees in the SACS stream will be covered under the SCHADS award, whereas clerical admin employees covered under the home care stream can be covered under the clerk's private sector award. Once again, it's not a clear-cut answer. Specific advice always needs to be provided. We can't look at it holistically. We really need to look at the business and the individuals employed, what they're actually doing on that day-by-day basis to provide the appropriate and specific advice to the business.
Yeah. No, perfect. Thank you. It's very detailed there. That was really good to hear and run through, and it's sort of opened my eyes to it all. I didn't understand that fully beforehand, so that's good. Thank you for that. Here's a really good one, actually. So shift workers versus day workers. What are the key differences between shift workers and day workers under the SCHADS award, and how should businesses approach rostering and pay for shift workers by comparison to their day worker benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess looking at shift workers versus day workers. So firstly, under the SCHADS award, there is a clause 21, that provides definitions, a really good one to always look up in the award. So we've got definitions for afternoon shift, night shift, and public holiday shift. So afternoon shift, generally speaking, shift that finishes after 8 p.m. before 12 midnight, Monday to Friday, and it tracks a shift loading. Night shift finishes after midnight, commences before 6 a.m., has a loading of 15%, and then we have the public holiday shift, which is between midnight on the night prior to the public holiday and midnight of the public holiday, 150% a penalty on the ordinary rate of pay. When we look at shift workers versus day workers, we see differences when it comes to annual leave, loading payments. Shift workers, in addition to their ordinary pay, will be paid either the higher of 17.5% of their ordinary rate of pay, or the weekend and shift penalties the employee would have received had they been on leave during that relevant period. Contrastingly, day workers, in addition to their ordinary rate of pay, will be paid annual leave loading of 17.5% of their ordinary rate of pay. To highlight just quickly with annual leave loading, this is an area we once again see lots of non-compliance with. If you're in a situation where you're not paying annual leave loading, so you're offsetting that into a flat hourly rate of pay or a salary, always important just to seek advice, because we do see quite a bit of non-compliance in that space, which can result into underpayment risk. Lastly, when we're looking at those shift workers, there is a section under the award for quantum of leave. So important to note that if you have a shift worker who works more than 4 ordinary hours on 10 or more weekends during the yearly period in respects to which their annual leave accrues, or the employee works at least 8 24-hour shifts during the yearly period, they have that entitlement to the quantum of leave. Really important to make sure that you're classifying your worker correctly, either as that shift worker or day worker, as it does attract different entitlements, which we'll have a look at on the next slide. So having a look at this scenario, it's a really good example of where we can see the differences. So firstly, if we're looking at a day worker, so the shift is 4 p.m. to 11 p.m. Let's say they're under the SAT stream, level 3.1 casual. The day worker is going to be paid the first 4 hours at ordinary, and then the 3 hours, because it's going outside of the ordinary span of hours, will then be classified at overtime payment. Contrastingly, if we have a shift worker doing that shift, the 4 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, they're going to be paid shift work penalty rates. There's different payments that are going to be attracted depending on how you've classified. If this is an area of uncertainty, if you don't know if you've classified your worker correctly as a day worker or a shift worker, really important to get advice specific to your business, as it will ultimately impact the minimum wages.
Yep. Perfect. Well, thank you for that example in the chart there as well. That's actually really useful. So our next one that we do have here is regarding minimum engagement. So understanding the minimum engagement rules under the SCHADS award and why they are important for the employers to understand. Following on from that, how can an employer ensure that they are meeting the minimum engagement requirements as well?
So with minimum engagement, a really important one. Seems simple enough, but once again can be a bit of an area of confusion for some businesses. So firstly, what is the minimum engagement? So for part-time and casual employees under the SCHADS award, there is specific minimum engagement. So SACS, social and community services employees, except those providing direct disability services, must be paid a minimum of 3 hours per shift. All other employees are entitled to a minimum of 2 hours per shift. However, for disability services employees who do not provide direct care, such as those in maybe administrative roles, the minimum engagement is 3 hours. Contrastingly, full-time employees, they do not have the minimum engagement requirements per shift. Instead, they must work a total of either 38 hours per week, 76 hours per fortnight, or 152 hours over a 4-week period. Their shifts are generally capped at 8 hours each, and they can work up to those 19 shifts of 8 hours in a 4-week period. Important with your full-time employees, you're structuring you have a good, robust hours of work clause within your employment contract that outlines how you're doing those hours. Once again, by mutual agreement, they can work up to 10 hours per shift if needed. I think a key takeaway when we're looking at minimum engagement is that at the end of the day, where the minimum engagement is not met, you're still required to pay those hours. So to jumped ahead of the game there. So to give a bit of an example, if you're rostering a support worker to see one participant for 1 hour of support, and that is the shift, there is nothing on either side of that 1 hour shift, you'll still be required to pay the minimum engagement of 2 hours.
Perfect. And look, exactly what you mentioned before with those individual flexibility agreements working up to the 10 hours, it's always good to have those reviewed and get that second opinion when you're writing those as well. So no, it's very, very good to see. Just seeing the start of your next slide there inspired another question regarding breaks and broken shifts. So how does the SCHADS award handle meal breaks and broken shifts, and what are the implications for employers? Following on, what would be some of the best practices for managing meal breaks and broken shifts to ensure the compliance?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, meal breaks, if an employee works more than 5 hours, they're going to be entitled to a 30 to 60-minute unpaid meal break. If this break is not provided, importantly, the employee will be paid overtime for all time worked until that meal break is taken. However, very common in the industry, if the employee is required to eat with a participant as part of their regular duties, this meal period is then paid at their normal ordinary rates and is considered time work. So essentially their meal break is paid and the time is counted as working time. In addition to the meal break, the award also has provisions for those 10-minute paid tea breaks, which are taken every 4 hours.
Yep. Perfect. Well, thank you for that. I guess we're sort of almost wrapping it up with the 2 last questions here now. So would you be able to provide some practical scenarios where businesses have struggled with SCHADS compliance and how they overcame these challenges as well? And then what resources or tools can a business use to ensure that they remain compliant in these different situations as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we'll do, what I might do, sorry, just expand a little bit more on the meal breaks and go into that kind of compliance side and flow in that way, because what we do see is lots of issues in this space. So and a lot of questions around what about if the meal break goes beyond 60 minutes. So a common scenario might be an employee performing disability services or home care work. And if the lunch break extends beyond 60 minutes, it's no longer then a meal break. It's actually going to be classified as a broken shift under the SCHADS award. And under this award, we do see 2 different allowances. So a broken shift allowance with 1 unpaid break, which is $20.12, and then the broken shift allowance with 2 unpaid breaks at $26.63. It's important to highlight as well that only employees performing disability services or classified under the home care stream can be rostered for broken shifts. Otherwise, this will be in breach of the modern award. To kind of go through a bit of an example scenario, if we have a SACS employee performing disability support works, let's say they're working 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., how does this look? So we've specified that it's a SACS employee performing disability support work. So we know that there is an entitlement there to broken shifts. We know that meal breaks are 30 minutes to 60 minutes under the modern award. Given in this scenario that the break is longer than 60 minutes, it's 2 hours, we're going to count that 2 hours as a broken shift, and therefore it's going to attract a broken shift allowance. Now, as under clause 10.5 of the SCHADS award, and as we mentioned a bit earlier, we have minimum engagements. So we've got the first 4 hours there being paid, broken shift, and then because the second shift is only 1 hour, we're still having to pay 2 hours to comply with the minimum engagement period under the modern award. Another scenario as well that we come across when we're looking at broken shifts, meal breaks, is what happens if the broken shift spans longer than 12 hours? So the total is over 12 hours. So if we have an employee performing home care duties, they start the shift at 6 a.m., they finish the shift at 10 a.m., we then have a broken shift that applies, and then they work from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Important to note that once that shift exceeds 12 hours, we're now going into double time, so overtime payments. So the minimum shift needs to be paid for both periods of work, broken shift allowance is paid, double time needs to be paid for all hours over the 12-hour span. So a really, really important one to just remember, because we do see issues quite commonly when it comes to broken shifts, meal breaks, overtime. You know, how does that all interact and work? This is a bit of an example here of how it would typically look in the payroll data. Don't quote those hourly rates. They're probably not with the current hourly rates, but it's an example of how it would typically look in a payroll system. So you've got your 4 ordinary rates, broken shift, and the allowance as well. And then onto that last question. Sleepovers. So sleepovers is such a big topic and a really common practice that we see in the industry. It's a really increasingly common shift type, and the award terminology governing these shifts doesn't always align nicely to NDIS guidelines, which does cause confusion and frustration sometimes for employers. What is it? A sleepover is when an employee is required to sleep overnight at the premises where the client is located, and it's not a 24-hour care shift or an excursion. Things to remember when you're rostering a sleepover shift is, number one, a sleepover needs to have a continual shift of 4 hours before or after the sleepover in one component. 2, the alternative side of a sleepover does not need to abide by the minimum 2 or 3 hour minimum engagement period. 3, the sleepover needs to have an 8-hour sleep component. 4, you are only required to have an 8-hour break between shifts before or after. And 5, is a sleepover a break? No. Think about it as almost like pressing pause on the shift. It doesn't break the continuity of the shift, but it does not count as time worked. So we'll go through just a quick example. We have a night shift that's finishing after midnight, starting before 6 a.m. Monday to Friday. So as the employee shift finishes at 7 a.m., they'll be paid the 15% night shift penalty rate for the hours worked from 6 to 10 p.m. on Monday and 6 to 7 a.m. on Tuesday. The minimum shift does not apply for the period of work in the morning, as the shift is considered a continuous shift, and there is still a total of 5 hours being worked, which is more than the minimum engagement period under the award. Once again, please disregard those hourly rates as they are just used there as an example.
Can I just go back one slide really quickly? We get this question a lot, and the question is really around why am I paying night allowance on that 6 till 7 a.m. And the best way I can describe it to everyone, and especially with this fantastic visual that Emma's produced, is that look at the shift starting at 6 p.m. the night before and finishing at 7 a.m. the next day. That is one shift. The best way to look at it to start to get your head into the gear of, well, that's why I'm paying a night shift. It's not a whole new shift. It started the night before and it runs the whole night all the way through to 7 a.m. It hasn't been broken in any way, shape or form. Sleepover is a type of work, and it just happens to sit in the middle of this shift.
Perfect. Thank you, Michelle. I think this is another really important example as well that we just wanted to highlight is when you don't have the 8 hours. So in this example here, the sleepover was extended to include that 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. to ensure that there is still the minimum 4-hour shift on either side. So if you ever have situations where the 8 hours isn't being complied, it's really important always to look at your rostering systems and seek specific advice to the business.
Yeah.
And then just lastly, what about in the scenario that you have active sleepovers? If you have a support worker that works during a sleepover, and what happens in that circumstance? Importantly, they need to be paid a minimum of 1 hour. So more, of course, if they work more than 1 hour, but a minimum of 1 hour at overtime rates. So for example, if they work multiple times during a sleepover shift, but less than 1 hour in total, the employee is entitled to a minimum of 1 hour payment.
Yep. Yeah, no, perfect.
Lovely.
I've got more compliance information if you're
almost done on the technical front. We could talk probably all day about SCHADS award and technical content and compliance. It is so complicated. But what we've tried to do very much in this podcast is highlight some of the most common questions and scenarios that we come across, so that hopefully it's clearer to businesses and you're getting some of that real important, valuable information to do with the SCHADS award. This is another really big one that we come across. I feel like I say this with every topic.
Do you want me to take this one, Emma? It's something that I've actually answered multiple times in the last few days for clients. This is probably, and in answer to your question, Nick, about compliance and the importance of it, this would have to be one of those questions that we almost always see clients having applied incorrectly, unfortunately, because it is one that the award has not built this to work with the businesses that we see. This is not written to support the way that people actually need to roster. So the award was very clear that we need to give a 10-hour break between shifts. What it also goes out to explain is that if a full-timer or a part-timer only, so this does not include casuals, if shift A, am I backwards? I don't know which way. So if we've got shift A and shift B, if shift A goes into, there's 10 hours between these two shifts. If shift A goes into overtime and it hinders that 10-hour break, then for full-timers and part-timers, there's penalties that can be applied to shift B. So that shift can still be worked, but it goes into pretty high penalties. Now, very clearly, it's only if shift A goes into one overtime and only if they're full-time and part-time. So if the same scenario happens with a casual, if they've not got 10 hours break between shifts, or if shift A goes extended and it hinders that 10-hour gap, and you start them again, it's a breach. It's a breach of the award. You cannot even pay extra money to overcome this problem. There has to be that 10-hour gap between shifts. Now, this is where it gets a little bit convoluted, because if shift A gets extended via ordinary hours, you're still at a problem because it hasn't been extended by overtime. And the clause is very clear that only if it's extended by overtime can you have those penalties up your sleeve to keep shift B going. So we see this one get applied almost always incorrectly, and it's very unfortunate because it's always a very, very costly mistake. It's either going to result in huge penalties for those part-timers and full-timers, or you're sitting there with a breach of the award. And those breaches are per occasion. So, times that by 30, 40, 50, 100 staff, you've got a pretty expensive problem.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for that explanation. Emma, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or are you happy for me to?
No, I think that was a really, really good summary. It's an issue that we see very commonly, and it's unless you're literally reading the SCHADS award day in, day out, it's a clause that can be missed. Clause 28.3.
I explain it to my clients all the time by saying I can do my own tax return. That doesn't make me an accountant. This is all we do. This is all we're good at. So there's a reason why we understand it probably better than the average person.
Yeah, I feel if I was to read the SCHADS award 7 times a week, I'd have 7 different understandings at the end of the week.
It can feel that way.
Good to have someone to actually understand it for me in that situation. Well, we have seen a few questions come through on the comments here, so we're sort of leaving this one open for questions and answers for the group now. I've got a few questions here if you're happy for me to read through those now.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
So the first one we had was from Catherine. Does leave during the fortnight count towards, I'm assuming, total overtime hours you meant there, Catherine, or count towards the hours count, I guess?
Ordinary hours, I think. Yeah, under normal circumstances, yes. If that's what we have seen in the past, is if someone works a lot in a few days and then takes some, say, annual leave at the end of the week, and the annual leave actually bumps them into more than 38 hours. So we do sometimes get some tricky situations. There's quite a few things we look into to answer that on a very specific nature. What were those initial hours? Is it a regular that they work those longer hours to start the week off? There's a few things we need to look into if ever that's the case. If adding normal annual leave or personal leave bumps you over 38 in a week, but under normal circumstances, yes, that would count forward.
Thank you for that. Another one here, so from Deanne. So for tea breaks, if a staff member works 2 hours in the morning, they then have a broken shift another 2 hours later in the day, are they entitled to an additional 10-minute payment, or do they need to do a 4-hour block before they get their 10-minute paid break?
It's such a good question from Deanne, because the clause doesn't specify that the time frame has to be worked in one block. So this is where we come to one of those situations where we go, okay, we've got to start defining something that's not defined, basically. My advice there is, I would probably advise my client, if they ask me that question, to look at potentially putting a policy in place that actually defines this for the company. So you're right, there is actually no answer in the award specifically. So we have to start creating what is reasonable. And a lot of the work I do with the commission when trying to fight something on my client's behalf is it's not reasonable unless it's been defined as reasonable. We do a lot of work with clients around, I guess, building policies, building specifics and situations for a client that in return actually defines it. So what my advice here, I guess, Deanne, is more so around the fact of try not to, it doesn't give us an answer. So create an answer. If it's reasonable, if it works for your company, then you should be okay. We can give specifics on that and actually look into the types of shifts your staff do to give a specific answer on it. I'd want to look at the workplace health and safety implications, if they're traveling a lot, if there's all these different things to look at. I'd start with defining it so there's no confusion around it as well. Have some sort of a break policy that could help.
Yeah. No, lovely. I've got one from Mark as well. So we won't do too many of these. We'll probably wrap up with another 2. If an employee has to work multiple times during a sleepover for less than 1 hour both times, do they incur? No, we've answered that one actually, Mark. We got that one. Yeah, so if they work multiple times, but it's under 1 hour, they're only entitled to that 1 hour regardless of how many times they work. If they work over that hour, they get that hour and additional. We've got one from Delia requesting a bit of more of an explanation around inter-shift travel. It seems a little broad. Would you guys be happy to talk to that one a little bit, or?
Inter-shift travel. So this actually pops up a lot. What we find the confusion lies with a lot of our clients is that they look at a shift for an employee as participant to participant. They look at participants as one shift and then the next participant as a new shift, when it's not. More than likely it's not. So if someone spends an hour with one participant and they travel 20 minutes to a new participant and then they see that participant for an hour, you've got to look at the employee separately to the participant. So it's a shift, it's a continuous shift. If they're traveling between one participant to another, then yes, it's going to be, you'll have travel time payable, but also usually some kilometres depending on if they're using their own car. So I guess try and break away from looking at it from participant to participant. What will answer your question when looking at your roster holistically is more looking at it as an employee base. What's the employee working? Irrelevant of what they're doing in a shift, looking at it more on an employee basis, and that should give you a lot more information when looking at your roster. But usually it's payable. The only other instance we come across where it gets a little bit murky is if you've had, say, a broken shift and you've got travel on either end. So this is where we start having to look at what is reasonable. So if somebody finishes work with one participant and they have a 4-hour gap between a broken shift and then the next participant, do you have to pay travel there and back from the end of participant 1 to participant 2? To answer that, it's sometimes yes, sometimes no. It all comes back to what is reasonable, and we're happy to always give sort of parameters around that, what we would define as reasonable. Again, this probably comes back to ultimately what we'd love to have in place there is a policy around if you have to travel X, or sometimes it gets a little bit tricky. You don't want to define yourself too much, but also give yourself enough definition to be able to fight it. So sometimes yes, sometimes no, depending on the situation on that one. Sorry.
No, that's all right. It definitely seems like it's a worthwhile engagement to actually sit down, discuss the organisation, their parameters, their rostering, and actually take a look at some individual organisation perspectives. So I think we might wrap it there for the questions, but it does sort of show from my perspective, obviously, the benefit from engaging with yourselves regarding these types of questions, because it is always going to be a different case. It's edge case, it's use case, it's by organisation, I guess. So it'd be really, really useful for them to reach out and engage with you guys there. So yeah, so it's been really, really lovely having you guys on board. Thank you very much for jumping through, answering some of our questions here and actually running through all of these items. This is recorded for everyone's purposes, so if we want to go back and refresh and have a look at some of these items, whether you're coming down to a payroll or you've got a question, feel free to come back here. But obviously the better alternative would be to reaching out to Effective HR directly, having a discussion and making sure that you're getting that support for yourselves. So yeah, it's been really lovely having you guys on board. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And Emma has happily offered up her time. Isn't she absolutely wonderful? For anybody listening, if they want to jump on with a complimentary session with Emma, you can scan that QR code and have a bit more of a chat about how we can help you and the different services that we offer. We're not locked in any way, shape or form. We're a fee for service. So if you only need us for a little bit, that's what we can provide, and up to the big projects. But it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah,
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll be saving that QR code for myself for future. Anyway, fantastic. Thank you very much, guys, and for everyone jumping on the call. Thank you for taking the time to listen in. It's been really appreciated. I hope that we've all taken some good data away from here today. But obviously, if there's some more specific requests that you need help with, feel free to reach out for the consultation session. And if it's something regarding the FlowLogic system, feel free to reach out to us directly as well. So I hope everyone else has a fantastic week up and coming, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's being done, but it hasn't been done. So if I'm ready,